Hello, everyone. Philip Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. Today is Monday, the 23rd of May, 2022, and today's topic is straight talk about reparations. Bottom line is reparations for slavery is a bad idea, principally because it ended 160 years ago. Nobody living today was penalized by slavery. Nobody living today benefited from the institution of slavery. To hold a class of people responsible for something that happened prior to their lifetimes is unfair. And to hold other people as beneficiaries for something, for an injustice that they did not endure, is likewise also unfair. If you want to collectively make a retroactive adjustment just because people of the Black race were once slaves, then consider also making an adjustment for the royalty payments that the inventors of the United States have been collecting for the last 160 years. Because the inventors of the most significant inventions during that period are white. I don't deserve a royalty because Thomas Edison made some great inventions, but he was a white man. I'm a white man, so if we're going to strictly do this on the matter of race, then yeah, give me my royalty check, and then maybe I'll be fine with paying you a reparations check. The other thing is that's important is that we've already had during the last 60 years a form of reparations in the form of affirmative action, beginning with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was passed to try and ensure that people of different races would be treated fairly. It was specifically stated in that act that whatever type of adjustment would be made would not include quotas. But within 5 years, the Civil Rights Commission ignored that, and they were focusing on quotas, and then they finally got the backing of the Supreme Court in 1971. So we've had about 60 years of affirmative action, which is another form of reparations for people in the present or in the past 60-year period to be compensated for whatever legacy they had from slavery that was holding them back, collectively, not individually, because some individual Blacks did very well, but collectively they were, they made the argument that they were held back. And so the affirmative action was adopted to compensate them for that. But it's been 60 years of that. In fact, since the 1964 War on Poverty, the federal government has spent over $22 trillion on various economics means-tested financial aid for the poor, without much result. And finally, let me point out that after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 came into being, a number of commissions were set up, including the Civil Rights Commission, the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, the Labor Department Office of Contract Compliance, et cetera, a whole alphabet soup of them. These agencies are overwhelmingly populated by Black workforces. They're not making any effort to see to it that their workforce looks like the people of America at large. They're very plainly dominated by Blacks and other minorities. So those, I think, are enough reasons alone to vote thumbs down on reparations. But another factor that is seldom mentioned is that the southern states have already paid a form of reparations that's generally not recognized. So I'm going to bring up some slides here to discuss this. For the first 25 years after the Civil War, over half of the federal budget was spent on three items, none of which benefited former Confederates. Interest on the federal debt, Union veterans pensions, and budget surpluses. Now, the interest on the federal debt is significant because the federal debt was almost entirely built up during the Civil War. And the interest that had to be paid on it was paid to Northerners, not anyone in the South. Former Confederates didn't have any Union war bonds. Those were all held up north. So that interest on the federal debt was strictly benefiting the Northern bondholders, not anyone in the South. But the Southerners had to pay their share of taxes to fund those interest payments. And similarly, in the 19th century, the federal government did repay its national debt. It did not try and manage it in a way that we do now, which is to keep it ever growing. So in the first 25 years after the Civil War, they actually paid down $1.7 billion of the Civil War debt. That too was strictly beneficial to the Northern bondholders and was of no benefit to the former Confederates or the former Confederate states. And then finally was Union veterans pensions, which in the first 25 years after the war totaled $1.1 billion. It would eventually total about $8 billion. And the last check was written in May of 2020. Because over the years, they gradually liberalized the veterans pensions. But the significant point, one of the significant points to keep in mind is that these Union veterans pensions did not include any Confederates either, right? They were not part of the Union Army, so they didn't get any of this benefit, but they had to pay their fair share of the taxes to pay for those pensions. And the pensions become a big deal because they grew over time. I'll just make the case here. This chart shows you that they started out fairly minimal. And then about 1880 and particularly about 1890, they started to shoot up. And then finally in 1893, I think it was, they accounted for 40% of the federal budget. And as I pointed out just a moment ago, over time, this turned out to be, it may well have turned out to be the biggest cost of the Civil War, which is paying the Union veterans pensions, because it totaled about $8 billion over time. And the disbursements, the annual payments themselves did not peak until about 1921, which was 21 plus 35, 56 years after the war had ended. So all three of these factors, Union veterans pensions, and payment on debt on the interest and down payment and paying down the federal debt. If the Confederacy had been a defeated foe, then those would have undeniably been categorized as reparations. It's kind of like, it's kind of like if you look at World War II and we gave our soldiers the GI Bill benefits so that after they served in the Army or in the military, they could go to college and get their college paid for. It's almost as though we require Germany and Japan to pay us reparations to pay off those tuition for those soldiers. That's kind of what happened here. I mean, the benefits were not tuition for the soldiers, but they did get their pensions, and the debt got paid off and the interest got paid off, and the South had to pay its share of those taxes to pay for that. Now, one of the things that the pensions were used to support were high post-Civil War tariffs. Now, in truth, a lot of these states, particularly in the present-day Midwest, would have liked to have had low tariffs because they produced agricultural goods that then could be exported to Europe, and they really were kind of advocates of low tariff in that context. But the South continued to be the principal advocate of low tariffs because cotton was still the predominant crop down there, predominant industry actually. And low tariffs would be beneficial for the raw materials producer. The manufacturers north of the Mason-Dixon line and the Ohio River, they, however, wanted high tariffs because they did not want manufactured goods coming in from Europe. They wanted to dominate the domestic market. It would take years before they would be ready to dominate, the international markets, but they wanted to first dominate the domestic markets, which means they wanted high tariffs on imported manufactured goods. That was bad for the exporters, including the South and the Midwest, because the people that would buy, the countries that would buy our export raw materials, such as agricultural products, were primarily in Europe, and they needed to be able to generate the exchange credits they needed to buy that stuff. And the way that they would generate their exchange credits would be to sell us manufactured goods. But the high tariffs made it hard for them to sell manufactured goods into the United States. Well, that was just perfectly all right with the northern manufacturers. And as you can see in this chart here, the tariff on dutiable items for the first 50 years after the Civil War averaged about 45%. And prior to the war, they were at 19%. So the North really got, the manufacturers got what they wanted out of the war, which was a high protective tariff. Now, it's true between 1915 and 1924, they dropped to about 29%, but that was principally because Woodrow Wilson became president and his agenda was, he had an agenda for lower tariffs. Once he got out of office, the tariffs went right back up. And they really didn't get low until after the end of World War II, when the manufacturing economies of the northern states had no competition anywhere in the world. After World War II, the economies of Europe and Asia were wrecked. So the only manufacturing economy in the world was in North America. And at that point, of course, the northern states were all for low tariffs because they had no competition internationally. And anything that lowered tariffs for them in that context would be good. So you can see the self-interest here by looking at how much the tariffs changed right after World War II. They dropped from an average of 45% for the first 50 years after the Civil War to 16% after the end of the World War II. But as I pointed out, during the 19th century, especially, a lot of the Midwestern states wanted low tariffs because they were still farm producers and they wanted to export their goods, their raw materials, grain primarily. And they had the same problem that the southern states did. High protective tariffs discouraged Europeans from buying American raw materials because it made it hard for the Europeans to generate exchange credits by selling us their manufactured goods. Now, they could sell manufactured goods to other countries that had low tariffs, and then they could buy their grain and their cotton from those other countries. But the North didn't care about that. All they cared about was, protect our industry, except for those Midwestern states that had agriculture. So what the Republican politicians did is they said, well, we're going to get you high union veterans pensions. We can't pay these union veterans pensions unless you let us have high tariffs. And so they basically used the union veterans pensions as a bribe to get votes to support high tariffs. But the extent of the penalty that caused on the export sectors of the United States economy were severe, and they were not racial. They were primarily the South was disadvantaged because there was no way for Europe to buy our cotton without selling us manufactured goods. The more we restricted their ability to sell us manufactured goods, the less cotton they could buy from us, which impoverished the South. And it's not generally well known, but about half of the sharecroppers in 1938 were white and about half were black. And they lived under similar economic conditions. Here's an example. There's 1938 black sharecroppers. I think that's in Arkansas. And there's 1938 white sharecroppers in Alabama. You really don't see much difference there. Now, to be sure, there was a social difference because the whites had a social advantage. But in terms of economics, there wasn't much difference. The whole South was impoverished by this. And there's been no reparations for that. It was an unfair economic policy, not just to black whites, but also, not only just to black Southerners, but also to white Southerners. And there's the proof there in those two pictures. So I think that's kind of the straight talk I wanted to give you about tariffs, or excuse me, about reparations. And again, I'll emphasize that the point that's probably going to be new to most of you, and certainly new to the academics, is the realization that a lot of the federal spending post-Civil War was for items that strictly benefited the North and did not benefit the South at all, and that the South, but the South had to pay their share of taxes for it. I do want to conclude here that a lot of what I'm talking about you'll find in this book, The Dreadful Frauds, Critical Race Theory and Identity Politics. $16 at Amazon, and $20 if you'd like an autographed copy from me. You can email me, Phil, PHIL _Leigh, LEIGH @me.com. And okay, that's our show for today, and I want to thank you for watching.